I'm Abby Kinney, and you are listening to Upzoned. Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of Upzoned, a show where we take a big story from the news each week that touches the Strong Towns conversation, and we upzone it. We talk about it in depth. I'm Abby Kinney, urban planner in Kansas City, and today I am joined by Chuck Marohn, who is back from traveling a lot, many millions of miles, it sounds like. So welcome back, Chuck. It's great to have you.
Hey, thanks, Abby. It's nice to see you again too. I have missed our times chatting every week, but now no travel for a while for me. So you and I will be able to do these through the end of the year together, if you'll have me every week. So
I'll think about it. We've had some pretty good we've
I know you
we've
have.
had some good guests on the show, so you've got competition now. So
That's good. No, we've got some smart people around here,
yeah,
so I'm glad.
definitely. Well, so today we've got a really interesting article today that I'm excited to talk about, specifically about the topic of short-term rentals. So there's a lot of articles on this topic right now, but I picked the one from Market Watch by Levi Sumigisi. It is entitled Airbnb Hosts Say Bookings Fell Off a Cliff Amid Influx of New Vacation Rentals and Rising Prices. So there's been a lot of speculation on the internet this week, almost to the point of it being a meme, about whether we are witnessing the great Airbnb bust, which is a fun way of saying that short-term rentals are a bubble that are popping before our eyes. As reported by the article, many short term rental owners have recently voiced concerns on forums like Reddit and Twitter and Facebook about their bookings dropping significantly over the past 3 to 4 months. In some cases, hosts are saying that they were at 80% occupancy and now they're all the way down to near zero. So at this point, it's not totally clear what is happening and why this is happening. There's a little bit of consensus on, I guess you'd say the supply and demand aspects of this issue. That is, there being a lot of pent up travel demand that was released in mid 2021 through the beginning of 2022 that drove the demand for short term rentals. Thus, the supply of short term rentals increased since the pandemic began. I think there's one article that cited that the supply was up 23% year over year over the past few years. And now, fast forward to 2022, quarter three, travelers are cutting back and which is slashing the demand for short term rentals. And another aspect of this is that apps like Airbnb and VBRO are now costing more. There's more cleaning fees and other things like that that are making them less competitive compared to hotels. So there's a lot of debate about why this is happening, but there is consensus that it's happening and people are seeing a massive drop in their bookings. So I do feel like short-term rentals are one of those things that people love to hate. And you can definitely see, on the internet right now, people are kind of gleefully cheering on this perceived demise of these platforms. I say perceived because I think it's more of a market correction than a complete bust. But I'd like to get your thoughts on this, Chuck. I'd also like to get your thoughts, I think, before we talk about this boom and bust situation that we seem to be witnessing, what the Strong Towns perspective on short-term rentals are generally, and are they a good thing? Do we want them to bust? Are they healthy for communities, fiscally, socially, culturally? What is there consensus on this in Strong Towns?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I think we've debated it a lot. And I guess I would just say there's probably not a consensus. I can give you my opinion. Um, I recognize where they're problematic, and where they're problematic, they can be very problematic.
Yeah.
Um, but on the other hand, I also recognize that if we were to go back 100 years to cities all over, not just North America, but all over the world, it was very common to rent a room. In fact, if you look at, in your part of the world and my part of the world, as our cities were developing in the 1800s and the early 1900s, you would have a handful of hotels, and those hotels would really be for the very rich, very wealthy people that would come to town. And they were kind of made out that way too, right? If you go back and find the ones that were built of that era, they're very glitzy, they got a lot of glamour, they're very nicely done. And then you would have like the next tier down, which would be you rent a place over top of the bar for the night, right? Like it was a hotel slash brothel in some ways. And the next tier down was renting a room from someone. And it was very common to, go to any neighborhood in a city and see people out front who would have a sign that said room for rent. And it might be a widow who needed money to, make ends meet, or someone who had an extra room where the kid moved out or whatever that they were going to rent out. But the idea that you could show up in the evening, give someone a little bit of money, rent a room, in the morning they would feed you breakfast and give you a bag of food to take on your way, was a very common way of housing people in, really for all time, but in modern American history in the last 150 years. Airbnb, in a sense, takes what zoning has outlawed or zoning has made difficult to do, because if you want to open a real Airbnb, you have to go through all kinds of zoning approvals and what have you.
Yeah.
But if you want to rent out your couch, or you want to couch surf, or you have an extra room, or you have whatever, or you have a duplex and you want to rent the other half out by the day instead of by the month, Airbnb allowed people to do that. And in that sense, I thought it was really, really positive, right? Like it's been a real positive influence on people's ability to get into a house, stay in a house, and make good use of a house over time. I think where it's become problematic is, as we have seen capital become looser, more accessible for people with a lot of money, people with a lot of money have been able to leverage very free flowing and easy capital to buy, rent many, many, many different homes in ways that have, clearly distorted housing markets, particularly in high demand kind of areas. Back in 2006, 2007, I knew a number of people who were house flippers, who like their thing was like they would go out and buy a house and you can flip it. It's like easy money. And you watched people do it. And I'm like, you are an idiot. Like, how are you a house flipper? And they're like, oh, it's really easy. I know what I'm doing. And I'm like, no, I don't think you do. A lot of those people got shellacked in 2007, 2008, when the housing market started to correct. I knew a number of them who declared bankruptcy or had huge losses that they suffered. I now today know a number of people, just like normal, regular, everyday people who own, we've got an Airbnb down in Florida. We go down there 3 times a year, but otherwise we Airbnb it out and it's great. We're making all kinds of money and we bought a second one. And I do feel like there's a certain aspect of this that is that. There's also a certain aspect of it that is big money, but this is kind of like I think the speculators, the armchair speculators way of participating in the latest housing boom, particularly in
Yeah.
like high vacation areas, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, there's different levels of host, right? There's the person who, is an owner occupant and they're renting out a room or a suite or an accessory dwelling. And I think it's important to make a distinction between those types of hosts and hosts that are absentee and running this thing as basically a hotel. And, that probably ranges from the more sophisticated investor, like some kind of fund that owns a bunch of these and are running kind of an Airbnb empire, to like, an individual entrepreneur who is kind of has built up a portfolio of properties and hopefully didn't over leverage on this position and kind of expect to be getting high revenue forever. That's kind of something that I wonder kind of how this will unravel, if this is a bubble and, people end up having to reposition how they're using these units. That may be a problem. um, yeah, I just think this is one of those things where, the technology that's been introduced to enable this kind of arrangement, it's kind of like the bird scooter of of housing, right? Like it's a technology that was kind of dropped in an ask for forgiveness kind of way. Cities didn't really know how to respond before, it was introduced to the market. So municipalities don't even really know how to enforce rules that they maybe adopt for them. I mean, it's really difficult. And you can't really put the genie back in the bottle. You can't put Pandora back in the box. People are already doing this. And it's made it very easy for people who may be unsophisticated investors to enter into this market. I think in this article, there was somebody who was being interviewed that was saying, I started doing this and I thought I was the smartest investor in the world. I was making all this money and all of a
Yeah.
sudden I'm not. It's one of those things where it's like you hit it at the right time, the right place, and you kind of think like I must be a very sophisticated investor when really it's kind of an unstable investment that seems like it'll just keep going up and up and up. And at the same time, I don't know if I completely am sold on the idea that this is a bubble. I think this is just a contraction that's pretty natural and will even itself out. Um, at the same time, I think that this, neighborhoods that are best kind of suited for short-term rentals, neighborhoods like the one that I live in, where there's kind of an over concentration of these rentals, and people are actually getting kicked out of their homes so that to be replaced by short-term rental units. I don't think that that's going away anytime soon unless there's a serious contraction in travel demand.
Well, let's look at that for a sec, because I feel like there's two sides to this current shakeout. And one is a supply side, but the other one is the demand side. And I think they're both very interesting. The demand side, I travel a lot. So I experienced this from the side of a traveler, is very interesting because in March of 2020, before the lockdowns, before all that, my family and I took a vacation to Florida. And when, we're from Minnesota, March in Florida is delightful because it is like 80 degrees warmer than where we're at. We went, and I remember we were kind of late in deciding when to go, and we were late in booking things. I got a 3-room condo for $50 a night.
Yeah.
And I did because there was just like everything was vacant, like everything. And we would show up, and it was in this big resort, and there was nobody there. Like there was just nothing. And this was the first week of March, so it wasn't kind of when we got to the whole meltdown thing. But you look at that, and it was very clear that if you had a strategy going into the pandemic, in the very early days, you were kind of freaked out. Owning an Airbnb, like I'm screwed. And then all of a sudden it went the other way because people said, I don't want to be in the city anymore. I'm going to go live in the countryside. I'm going to get an Airbnb for a week or a month or what have you. And there was you saw the prices rebound again.
Yeah.
Then they kind of settled back down. And then you had this huge kind of outpouring of demand from vacationers. We're going to go on vacation. And just looking at demand, I'm sorry, not looking at the supply yet and how the market responded to that, but just looking at the demand, again, you had this like overwhelming peak of demand that now has, because that travel season is over, but also because of inflationary pressures and what have you, has started to shift people's spending habits away from vacations, away from these type of experiences. And you're starting to see that demand fade away. I think in a market that, if we can talk about supply next, is oversaturated from a supply standpoint, demand that is much less than supply, or even like slightly less than supply, will make the prices drop incredibly. In other words, there's a lot of downward room for prices to fall once there's not enough people to get into places. If you have 10 units and you have 11 people that want them, there's going to be price competitiveness. If you have 10 units and there's 8 people that want them, there's going to be a lot of pickiness in the market and prices will come down really fast. And I think that's what we're seeing right now.
Well, so let's think about this as a correction, though, because I think that, we could say that prices will just simply come down, but if there are people who have borrowed money against these properties, say they, bought an old house, an old duplex or an old sixplex, and they said, I'm going to turn these all into Airbnbs and I'm going to put a lot of money into it because I'm going to get more revenue from this property than, I would get if I was renting it out to long-term renters. I mean, there are people who have, I think, over leveraged on these projects. And so, while the idea is that they would lower the prices, and I think the lower prices will be the more competitive units. I think that there's a possibility that supply may go down as people pivot and as these units may turn over to become long-term rentals, or have other uses, or maybe they become fully furnished long-term rentals. That's kind of what I'm curious about, is what does that do to supply as the actual hosts that are experiencing this make decisions based on the nuances of their investment, right? Like there may be some people who overextended that may need to pivot. There may be people who turn these over and use these spaces for different reasons. Does that make sense?
No, and I think that that is true, and I think that in any marketplace you would see that kind of thing happening, right? The problem is that housing is not like any other marketplace
Yeah.
because you're talking about a house that should be rather inelastic in the sense that like everybody needs a house, everybody needs a place to stay, and clearly we've had this long stretch where we've not been building enough to take what we have been building and convert them into short-term rentals has further like shifted that market. And I think it's an open question about how far the other way it can go. Um, like I said, if you have 10 rentals available, short-term rentals, and you only have 8 people that want them, there's a lot of room for the price to go down.
Yeah.
But I think the weak players in that have to get out then. And you go very quickly to having 8 or 7 rentals available instead of 10, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't think it would necessarily take much to stabilize the market again from that standpoint. The interesting thing, and I feel like this is the supply story, is that housing has become such a financialized product now that what we see is a level of volatility in the housing market that mirrors the stock market. Right? We think of housing as being the stable investment that people make to pay off over time. You invest in a house, you secure a mortgage, you pay that mortgage off. At the same time, you have ongoing maintenance costs for that house. You're actually not making money per se, you're kind of losing money, but you have a place to stay. So in a sense, you're paying rent to yourself. There's some ways you build equity in doing this that make sense over a person's lifetime.
Yeah.
Once we convert housing into a financial product, now what you see is that aspect of living in a place becomes this thing that generates for you equity that you can cash out, that you can use. That in itself makes you bid higher for homes, which brings up housing prices. You also see where the short-term rentals and the other aspects of homeownership, not to mention the hedge funds buying houses and the all cash sales and all that, start to make the kind of the sharp edge of the market function more like a stock than this stable kind of bond like investment.
Hmm.
And so what happens is you start to see this volatility in prices. Prices can shift 5-10% in a very short period of time, can shift 20% within a year, 30% within a year. You can't run a housing market for people like you and me. You can't run a housing market for non-investment people where the marginal buyer, the person actually setting the price, has 5, 10, 20% price shifts that they're
Yeah.
dealing with.
Yeah.
And so it creates all this instability in the market. And when you get people like this one person I know who just bought, who bought in the last couple of years a couple of places in Florida that they're Airbnb. I actually think they're screwed. Like I don't know their personal financial situation, but you're going to be taking on a lot of loss and trying to get out of that thing, with as much remaining as you can at some point. And that's just a result of financialization more than the so let me create these two scenarios. Scenario number one, a widow or a widower has a spare bedroom and needs the money to make ends meet and stay in their house. I feel like in that situation, we're all like, yeah, Airbnb, like great, like let's stabilize the neighborhood.
Yeah.
That transaction actually tends to stabilize the value in the neighborhood, which is good for everybody. Let's take scenario number two. The person I know from up the street has access to capital that regular people can't because they have a little bit of money. They use that capital to buy a vacation home in Florida and then put it on Airbnb for 48 of the 52 weeks a year and use that money to, what have you. That person is a speculator, right? Like that person is distorting the market in weird ways that wouldn't be available if that capital wasn't so cheap and readily accessible.
Hmm.
And having that capital now become more expensive through interest rates, while at the same time demand for that product goes down, I think that type of person is the frothy one that's going to get knocked out of the market. And just the question is, how much damage do they do on the way down?
Yeah, and does it ultimately end up being a good thing or bad thing for people who actually live in neighborhoods? Because at the end of the day, I mean, it is concerning that housing has become such a commodity that now we're turning neighborhoods into hotels. I mean, that's I would say that's probably not a good thing for neighborhoods
No, it's
broadly.
bizarre.
Yeah, it's
Right.
very bizarre. And as somebody who lives in a neighborhood that is kind of the cool neighborhood where people want to visit the city and they want to stay in a neighborhood like this because of the destinations, the unique vibe, you're starting to see a lot of existing older housing stock that is moderately
Mhm.
priced for homeowners or renters get turned over to investment properties. And there's one listing in my neighborhood that literally the title was party house, and it became a huge party house.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it became a huge problem. And I will say that I'm not totally against short-term rentals, but these things happen, especially when they're being managed by people who are speculative owners. They're trying to pull as much revenue out of these properties as possible. It's not necessarily about creating a home for somebody or like ethically running a property. So that is problematic in a housing crisis. We're all talking about this housing crisis. We're short all these units. By the way, there's studies that say there are 2.5 million Airbnbs. So you've got to wonder what that actually does to the housing supply dynamics. At the same time, in again, you can't necessarily put the genie back in the bottle. So this is one of those things where it's like in a functioning market, if there is a demand for both residents and visitors to be located in a neighborhood, why are we not just building a lot more housing? Why can't the market respond to this demand? I mean, we know there's a lot of reasons why it's very difficult to actually get anything built in this country, but it seems like the higher revenue points from Airbnb and other short-term rental apps would lend themselves really well to helping to fund very expensive new construction and actually leave the older construction to long-term residents.
Yeah, but this is where I think you're right. But I also think that this is where our broken financial system is actually creating the wrong signals to investors. Um, we've talked in the past about how having 0% interest rates is like removing gravity from the system.
Yeah.
It just makes things grow in weird ways. And you get these financial tumors, you get these financial like weird growths that don't make any sense. But there's no corrective mechanism. You're starting to see gravity come back into play now with interest rates like slowly climbing up, which means the cost of money actually, is starting to manifest again. If there's no cost of money, there's really not much at risk for doing crazy, insane things
Yeah.
with capital.
There's no
And if
skin
you
in the
can access
game.
capital, there's
Yeah.
no skin in the game. And now all of a sudden, with capital starting to cost more, there is. And so I the difficulty that we're working through, I think, across the whole housing sector is not only the fact that zoning is messed up and the way that we build homes is messed up and that we should be building a lot of homes when we're not, but we've also turned the housing stock that we have into an investment device akin to a stock or closer to a stock than it's ever been. And so the people buying and transacting in them, the marginal buyer, again, the buyer that outbids everybody else, is looking at that bid as an investment, not as a home. And looking at the bid as an investment, you have different functions than you otherwise would. We rent as an organization an Airbnb every year in Florida. Next month, we have a staff retreat. There's going to be 18 of us staying in 2 Airbnbs next to each other in Florida. We rent 2 like 8-9 bedroom places, and it's a really good way to do a staff retreat for a fully remote company. We all go there and hang out. They are cheap buildings. They are built in a sense for the Airbnb market. They're basically next to Disney World, and so they're built for a tourist market. The buildings themselves are probably financed over 30 years, but without intense maintenance, they're not going to last 15. I mean, they're basically being junked because they're hotels. I mean, that's what they're designed to be. And you look at that and recognize that that is a business model that probably makes a ton of sense for the people who bought into it,
Mm-hmm.
so long as they can keep the occupancy up. As soon as the occupancy goes away, it's a horrible business model. And all those properties would be dumped if it happened for any extended period of time.
Yeah.
Being next to Disney World is one way to ensure rentals. Being in Kansas City or Brainerd, Minnesota, or wherever else, as nice as these places might be, those to me are a lot frothier and a lot more subject to the downward trend. And I think the big question here about the Airbnb correction, okay, is what of the rest of the market will it drag down? Because if it's just the Airbnb speculators that lose money, okay, fine. But that's never what it is, right? It's like, how much of the rest of this is it going to drag down?
Yeah, it'll be really unfortunate if the entire American economy is like that's the one card that falls is to the Airbnb market, and it just we're just being
Well, we're in
hoisted
this.
up by Airbnb.
It's kind of silly, but
Yeah.
we're in this situation where it comes to housing where prices need to come down because they're
Yeah.
unaffordable, but prices can't come down because so much of our wealth as a nation is tied up in home prices, from everywhere from cities' budgets to personal retirement plans are tied up in the wealth of homes. And so home prices can't come down, but they
Well,
also have to
yeah,
come
and
down.
and we've borrowed money against, these supposed high values that I don't know. I've been a homeowner for a couple of years now, and it's like the amount that the increase in that my current home has apparently gone up in value seems completely fake. Like, it just doesn't make any
Right.
sense. And the fact that we have this whole housing economy that spikes in these ways that are really irrational. I mean, it's unfortunate that we're leveraging against something like that and in the way that we are, because it does feel like a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. But my house has doubled in on Zillow in the last 6 years since I bought it.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is I got my tax appraisal from the county, and they have it valued at near that as well. And so let's say that there's actually a correction and it goes back to what I think it should normally be, which is a substantially less than that. Um, my community is planning on this much tax from me, and they're actually going to wind up getting this much tax in a year or two
Hmm.
when things straighten out. And how do you make that work? You make that work by like dramatically raising tax rates in a recession, in a downturn, in an area of high unemployment, in this. So what do? You cut government services in a government that has massive amounts of backlogs of everything and is struggling to maintain everything that they have. How do you cut from that? So, to me, there will be something at some point that pricks a bubble. Maybe it's this, I don't know. But the housing market is very unstable right now
Hmm.
because it is not responding to reality as people experience it on the ground.
Yeah. It's scary. It's a scary thing to think about, and scary that it could be Airbnb that takes this whole thing down.
Well,
Um,
if it is, there'll be a window where we can get really cheap Airbnbs. So maybe we should go and take a European vacation or
yeah,
something.
right. Save your pennies. Okay, so let's leave it there. But before we finish today, it is time for the down zone, which is the part of the show where we can share anything that we have been reading or watching or listening to, anything that's been taking up our time these days. So, Chuck, I'll throw it to you. What have you been up to?
Well, Stella, my youngest one, was assigned for school of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yep.
yeah, I love Steinbeck. I love his writing. I mean, I've said many times if he wrote the phone book, it would be the most beautiful phone book ever, right? Like I really admire his writing.
Yeah.
And so I joined her in reading this, and she didn't like it, but she's a very smart kid, but she's like, Dad, I like happy stories.
Hmm. Yeah.
And A Mice and Men is not a happy story, but it's been good. I enjoy having daughters who are of an age now where they're reading intelligent stuff and then can have thoughtful conversations about it. So
Yeah.
yeah,
That's actually pretty exciting. You have like a reading buddy and you guys can start a Marohn
yeah,
House book club. So,
yeah. Well, she tends to. I mean, obviously, they both tend to have different tastes than Dad, um, and all that. But it's fun when there is overlap. I mean, I read what's Eli Wiesel book that she read a couple years ago, and Chloe read the Something Wicked This Way Comes. We read that together. So there's just things that they've gotten into, and it's fun. And last week Stella went with me on my last trip, so I went to Jacksonville and gave a talk, and then she had a few days off from school. And so she came with, and we went to Disney World together for a couple days. And so just the two of us, when you have two daughters, you don't get to spend an extended amount of times very often with just one of them.
mhm.
So to be able to spend really 3.5 days with just one of them as my companion was a priceless ton of fun.
That's
So
awesome.
yeah,
Well, that's a lot of fun. I remember when I was probably your daughter's ages, my father actually travels a lot for work, and I used to love going on work trips, wherever it was. And going to Florida and other places like that, Chicago, and getting to spend a few days seeing a cool place. So yeah, that's great. So I guess what I wanted to share this week was that I've actually been starting a puzzle. So every winter, I usually go out and get like 1,000 piece puzzle. And I've actually started one that I already have and have been starting to work on it. And I've been doing some research on actually making custom puzzles using like your photography, or I have a cousin who
Yeah.
has really beautiful photography that I actually want to create a puzzle out of. So I've been spending some time this week basically researching that. If you have any recommendations for puzzle companies, I'm not sure if that's your thing. Please let me know. I'm in the market for a new puzzle, and I want to get something really interesting and cool because basically between now and the end of winter, I like to have at least one, large puzzle that I will continuously work on through the winter. So I'm in the market.
Is this like meditation time?
Yeah, it's just something to do. I'm not really good at like sitting around and not doing anything. That's why I listen to audiobooks because I like to keep myself moving. So yeah, I guess it is kind of a form of meditation. I really like working on puzzles, and it's something that I will work on for maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes. I'll do it in small increments. Just, after work, as I'm doing other things sometimes. So
I have a couple family members who are into puzzles, and they will like, yeah, get the huge ones.
yeah.
And there's been a couple disappointments where there's like one piece missing at the
Yep.
end, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yep,
But
that's
yeah,
happened to me, and
yeah,
it's heartbreaking when there's one
I've
piece.
watched that Heartbreak.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like you're on the last piece and it's always somewhere, in the middle of the puzzle, and you're like, "Where is
right.
it?" And you're looking
Hmm.
under everything, and it's like a frantic situation. So,
Yeah, but you're right. It's never been my thing, and I don't know. It's not that I don't mind it. I like doing it with friends as like a social thing sometimes. But yeah, I read books. I mean,
yeah.
that's what I said. Like, I actually have like 4 books going on right now, and I'm like, oh yeah. Last night, because I've been gone, I was gone for 10 days in a row, and when I got back, it's like I found this old friend again, and it was this book that I'm like a third of the way through and was really enjoying, but didn't bring on my trip because I brought my Kindle on my trip, which has like way too many books in it. And I found this book and I'm like, oh, I've missed you, old friend. Like, let's sit down and get to know each other again. So if I got 15 minutes here or there, that's what I end up doing.
What's interesting is that I had the same feeling as I've been working on this puzzle that I already did. Like I remember
Mhm.
specific pieces and, how they connect with other pieces. That's kind of interesting that you say that because it's like almost like a photographic memory. I don't have a photographic memory, but
Yes.
there's things that you just really clearly remember, how certain pieces match together, and working on one particular piece. And so I actually have pieces that I like remember being frustrated by, or remember where they go without looking at the picture. So yeah, I love puzzles. I want a new one because working on one you've already done is not as fun, I don't think, as getting a new one. So
Well, I will keep my eyes open for you. I've been, when I look at them, I'm like, okay, you get these ones with all these colors and all this depth. And I'm like, okay, well, that looks hard. But then the hardest ones look to me the ones with like not a lot of, like, very simple ones, right?
yeah, I think I'd
Like where the
rather
color
do
gradations
one.
don't change as much.
Yeah, I don't really like that. I would rather do one that has enough going on that you can start to like make logical matches and organize the
Okay.
pieces. Maybe, I feel like it's my OCD tendencies, and that's why I like working on puzzles. I like to organize all these pieces and start putting it together. So, yeah.
Okay. I will find you a good
Yeah,
puzzle.
find me one, please. That would be great.
I will.
Okay, well,
Thanks,
we'll
Abby.
end it there. Thanks everybody for listening to another episode of Upzoned. Keep doing what you can to build a strong town. Thanks, Chuck.